In this class we're going to look at the features of a business research report. I will start with the problem definition. A problem is any situation which requires further investigations. A clear statement of the problem may indicate possible solutions. So, first of all, identify the problem, and in identifying the problem, it may indicate the type of solutions that may be offered. Sometimes stating the problem is half the battle. So, any research investigation requires a clear statement of the problem. Now, the research objectives. Well, discuss the purpose of the project. That's essential. What is the prime focus of the objectives? What's it trying to do? What's the objective of the research activity? What's it trying to achieve? So set that out at the start. A good research proposal will follow a clear set of objectives. If it doesn't have those, the activity will be confused. It'll go in circles. It'll be broadly a waste of a lot of time. General and specific objectives should be stated. So the general objectives are to investigate the market. The specific objectives could be to look at the influence of pricing policy on the sales of a particular product in the market. So it has the general and it has a specific objective. So it's important to state those so as to have clarity for the research. Without the objectives clearly stated, as I said, the research may lose its way. Now, background material. Well, include a review of previous research conducted in the area. That's always a good starting point. Find out what has been done and discuss it. Discuss what the outcomes of that research were and how the research was conducted. Explain why the research was approved and the likely benefits it will yield. So, when looking at a piece of research, explain why the research is being conducted. What's the benefit of the research? What does it do? And in the context of business research, that's very important. Every activity should have some value associated with it. And research is no different. What will the research add to the value of the business? How will it help the business? The sources and references from work consulted should be produced. It's important to be as open as possible about the sources that were used, so that there's a clear trail of research. A trail has been set down that subsequent or follow-on research may look at and may scrutinize and say, well, the research was inadequate because it didn't look at this, or it did look at that, or whatever. In other words, there's a clear trail, research trail being set out, and references and sources are being produced. In addition, the outcome from previous research should be discussed and its limitations listed. If the previous research was good, then perhaps there's no need for the present research. Or perhaps just the present research is checking that the previous research is still accurate. But by and large, research activities are proposed because previous research has been found to be wanting in certain areas. Perhaps the type of data it collected or the techniques for analysis are not considered to be good enough. Or perhaps the market has changed significantly since the research was undertaken, so new research is now required. Now, the report headings relating to the methodology section. The methodology section is the section that deals with the method of the research. Research must have a method, and the method must be as objective as possible. So every piece of research has a methodology. How does it go about conducting the research? How is the research undertaken? What is its methodology? What is its method? So the headings here, well, first of all, the research and sampling design. Where does the information come from? Is it a sample of customers, or a sample of researchers, previous researchers, or academics, or is it a sample of some relevant population that suits this particular product or this particular business? So how is the sample collected? And that's the next point. How is the data collected? What procedures are used to collect the data, and is it collected objectively, or is it just collected as a means of convenience? If it's business research, does the research just interview some of the local people, some of the local residents, and get their opinions? It depends on the nature of the business. If the business is just supplying the local residents, that may be good enough. But if it's a national business, then perhaps asking local residents will not be appropriate. The responses may not be representative of the full set of customers or interested parties. So it's important that the data is collected as objectively as possible, and there must be a methodology for the collection of data, and it must be analysed correctly. It must be analysed objectively. The researchers must not distort the findings by using methods of analysis which exclude data, perhaps exclude findings that they don't like. So the data analysis should be objective, and it should use accurate and reliable tools of analysis. Then what are the limitations of the study? The sample size, for example, as I said before. How many people are interviewed if it is based on a sample? How many, and how are they found? How are they selected? If it's a market research activity, how are the respondents selected? Are they selected randomly? In other words, each one has an equal probability of being selected, or are they selected with bias? Are they selected on the basis of convenience, going into the street and stopping people? Because that is biased. The people stopped they might look professional and polite, whereas the people that need to be stopped should include people who are going to work in different occupations, manual occupations, professional occupations, people going to shops, people dropping children off at school. I mean, try to avoid the bias of just selecting one type of person. Then again, it depends critically on the nature of the study, but bias is a real issue and needs to be addressed. And there will be much more in the classes in this area discussing bias. What sampling method is used? Is it, and it relates to the selection of the sample, but what method is used? Is it based on looking at everybody of a certain age group, and how are they found? Is it looking at people in a certain locality? So there are lots of issues in selecting a sample. It's not just a question of going out with a clipboard and stopping some people. The findings, well, the findings must be related to the limitations. They can't say that the findings are true in all time, because the findings are subject to the limitations of the study. If there are many limitations of the study, then the findings will be weak, and they should be stated as weak findings. They should not be offered up as a true and fair account of what's happening in the marketplace, because it's a picture, but the picture may be biased. It may not have enough respondents. The respondents may be biased, as I said, or the techniques of selecting the data may be biased. So the findings are conditioned or conditional upon the limitations. The conclusions of the methodology, well, the conclusions are based on the findings. They must be exclusively based on the findings. The conclusions can't be based on anything else. And the conclusions will justify or contradict some hypothesis. The hypothesis is the testable statement. The testable statement was the question which was asked in the survey. Was the hypothesis accurate, or was it not accurate? Was the statement accurate or not accurate? Was the question right or wrong, if you like? And that is the conclusion. But the conclusion must be based on the research. Recommendations. Well, the recommendations must also be based on the conclusions. The recommendations can't again be based on anything else. So the recommendations are based on the conclusions. The conclusions were based on the findings, but the findings were based on the data analysis, and there were limitations to all of that. Limitations in terms of the sample size, the bias, and so on. So the recommendations must be seen in that context also. The appendices, well, this is where the report may include extraneous information, perhaps details that it would be difficult for the reader to find these details, but perhaps the researcher could take a photocopy of them if it's appropriate to do so and include it in the appendices. The appendices are where material that is not central to the report, but which have been used in the compilation of the report, where this material is offered for the reader to look at. In other words, it's trying to be as open with the reader as possible and say the following information was used, but the reader may find it difficult to find that information, or the reader may be just interested to see how it was done. So, for example, a copy of a questionnaire may be included in the appendices, or some report from the past may be included in the appendices. Nowadays, because of the ubiquitous nature of the internet, sometimes just some web addresses and some online material may be referred to in the appendices. Then we've got the bibliography. The bibliography is just a list of sources that were used. The sources are organized alphabetically by surname or by the name of the report. Sometimes reports are put into a separate heading in the bibliography. So you may have books and articles by author in one section and reports in a separate section in the bibliography. But all the sources that were consulted in the production of the work should be referred to in the bibliography. And the bibliography is very important. It should be organized alphabetically so that it's easy for the reader to find a particular reference. Now let's mention sampling design. Once the target population has been identified and the sampling method selected, the major part of the work is done. So let's say there is a problem, a business problem. Now, in order to address the problem, the business needs information. So first of all, where does the information reside? Where is that information? Well, the information is with some target population. it could be with the suppliers. The suppliers may be the target population. It could be with the customers, the final customers for the product. That could be the target population. And then some sampling method is required, which is as objective as possible, so it's not biased. But once those two parts are done, then that's a major part of the work completed. Now, the sampling design contains additional information, however. Types of sampling to be used, for example, probability or non-probability sampling. Now, probability sampling means that the respondents have been selected according to some probability method. Perhaps all the respondents were given a number. If the target population was known, then all of the respondents within the target population were given a number, and then numbers were taken out of a hat randomly. That would be probability sampling. And actually, that's probably the best way of getting a sample which is not biased. Non-probability sampling is asking your friend, or standing on the street with a clipboard and stopping people, because the chances are the people with the clipboard will only stop nice people. Nice people in their estimation, in their biased estimation. So we have two types of sampling, probability and non-probability. Probability sampling, for example, random or complex random sampling. Random sampling means that every person selected has an equal probability of being selected. Standing on the street doesn't give everybody the same chance of being selected. Only certain people will be selected according to the bias of the interviewer. So random sampling is probably the best to reduce bias. Non-probability sampling, for example quota sampling or snowball sampling, now these will be dealt with in separate videos. But a quota sample could be, let's pick every fourth person that comes down the street. That's a quota, and then let's just pick 100 of those. It's biased because it's only people going down that particular street at that time of day. But then again, the person doing the interviewing can't say who every fourth person is. So it's not too bad in that sense. It's better than snowball sampling, which is just asking a friend and then asking the friend to ask his or her friends to help out as well, so that you're getting some references onto more people whom you may go and ask. Then you ask those people to recommend some more people. So it's snowballing. But it's snowballing in a very biased way. A discussion of the sample size and selection to be used is important. How many should be asked if it's a sample? 10, 20, 50? What is the right number? Now, statisticians have all sorts of rules, and generally for a large sample it should be over 30. But it depends. It depends on what's been required and the accuracy of what is being required. And it's also a function of what's the budget for the whole activity. Perhaps there's not a lot of resources available for the whole exercise, so not too many people can be asked. So it depends on the cost of conducting the survey. The levels of confidence and the margin of acceptable error that's acceptable in the findings. Well, how confident do the researchers want to be in the findings? Do they want to be 95% confident that they've worked out how much is spent on this product? Do they want to be 95% accurate of regarding the expenditure of customers on holidays every year. It depends on what's been tested and how precise do they want to be. Do they want to be 95% confident? Do they want to be 68% confident? Do they want to be 99% confident? The more confident they want to be, the bigger the sample size, generally speaking, and it should be random. So more confidence, more expenditure, more cost, and a much more detailed type of survey. If it's snowball sampling, then the confidence must be very low. There's a big question mark. It may be misleading, the findings may be totally misleading, or it may be just some insight. So it depends on the technique for the sampling. Random sampling is the best. 95% confidence level will require a large number of respondents to be found and interviewed or tested or whatever it is, and it should be done in a very unbiased way. Now the research design, well, the nature of the research design is, first of all, design of questionnaires, definition of interview, the setting and design, and questions and piloting. So the design of questionnaires is not as straightforward as it may appear. Questions have to be unbiased. Sometimes questions can be misleading, or questions can be leading questions. Don't you think that the government is doing a good job? That's a leading question. It's easier for people to say, well, yeah, they are. So we have problems about leading questions, and this is why piloting a survey is so important. Piloting means conducting the survey in advance to try and see what issues are there in the questionnaire, to see if it's biased. And also making sure that the questionnaire is conducted in a place where it's quite pleasant. People don't mind standing around or sitting around answering the questions. And that's a function of the environment. If it's outside, it should be a nice day. So there are issues about questionnaire design. There's the issue, as I said, of questionnaire development and pre-testing. It's important to list out both the primary and the secondary forms of data that were used. Secondary would be published data, but the published data may indicate the type of questions that need to be asked. Primary is getting information firsthand. But pre-testing, piloting the survey is very important because it shows up any issues in the work and helps to clarify the questions and also make sure that the sequence of the questions is correct. So generally speaking, pre-testing is very important. And look at the data that was collected. The scales and instruments used. For example, if you're collecting attitudinal data, people's attitudes about something, you might give them a scale and say, well, do you believe that the government is correct in a certain policy? Do you strongly believe this? Do you moderately believe it? Do you disagree with it? Do you strongly disagree with it? So you've got a scale. But you have to be careful because the scale itself is subject to scrutiny, and do you have 5 points on your scale or 7 points on the scale, or how is the scale worked out? And care must be taken so as not to present biased results. So there's a question of sampling, coding the questions so that they're easily able to analyze the answers, and looking at the methods of data input. So for example, when the survey is over, is it possible to work out how many people agreed with the policy or disagreed with the policy. And how is the data to be analysed? Perhaps input into computers or into software for analysis, and does the software make sense of what has been put in? In other words, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the whole exercise? Copies of materials used and the technical details could be placed in the appendix. So the appendices, if there's more than one, the appendices may include reports or the questionnaire itself, or background material as to how the questions were derived, even minutes of meetings that were conducted between the members of the research team in discussing the issues that were important in the design of the questions, the sequencing of the questions, and the delivery of the questions, the pre-testing and the actual survey that was conducted, and any issues that arose. Now, for data collection, well, in a business context, primary data is important for research and ultimately decision making. In a business context, primary data is what is important. You see, the competitors will all have access to the same secondary data. If it's government reports, then all the competitors will have access to that. So there's no great insight into the market from secondary data. Everybody has the same information. But primary data could give a business some unique insight. So primary data is very important for business. So business research based on primary data is very important. Now, data analysis. Well, this section of the report should discuss the various the variables available to analyze the data. It should discuss how the data is being analyzed. So look at software, look at what skills the researchers need to be able to analyze the data. Once the analysis requirements have been determined, then some method of analysis should be set out, and any assumptions that are made within that should be made clear. For example, in the case of, let's say, working out a trend, a business trend, once the data has been collected, then perhaps some members of the team would want to use, let's say, a regression technique. Well, generally speaking, regression techniques are straight lines. Is the trend a straight line? So perhaps if they're going to use regression lines, which are the subject matter of other videos, if they're going to use a regression line, then they're assuming that the trend is a straight line. Well, that's an assumption, and that needs to be stated. And perhaps alternative techniques should be offered up as well, should be used as well, just in case the data is not following a straight line. The validity and reliability of the data should be checked carefully. Is the data valid? If the exercise was conducted again, would the same results be found? How reliable is the data? How representative of the true situation is the data that's been collected? Is it biased? What degree of bias is included? How reliable is the data? So validity and reliability are important. Now the limitations. Well, the limitations of this study should be explicitly and comprehensively discussed. This is what gives credibility to the research. Limitations should be openly discussed. It shouldn't be swept under the carpet, under the proverbial carpet. It's important that the limitations are set out so that the reader knows that the exercise is subject to those limitations. And the results can be understood in the context of the limitations. The findings, well, findings should show a link to the quantitative data that generated it. So findings should show a connection with the data that generated it. The findings must not be separated from the data. The findings are based on the data. They're based on the analysis of the data that was collected. There must be a linkage, and it should be obvious to the reader that the findings are based on the results of the survey or of the data collection methods. They should show the trends or insights clearly, depending on the type of methodology used, for example, quantitative or qualitative. But they should show clear explanations of the data, of patterns in the data. That was the purpose of the exercise. It was to collect data, to show some patterns, to give some insights into perhaps the market and how the market is moving or changing or whatever. So it should give those insights. And it should be obvious to the reader that the data collected, the data that was used, gives the insights. Use charts and graphs and tables to represent quantitative data. Make it interesting. Present the data in clear fashion. Don't hide anything. Make it as clear as possible and make it as easy as possible for the reader to understand. The conclusions. Well, conclusions are what we call inferences. These are the conclusions are statements that are based on the findings. They should be directly related to the research objectives or the hypothesis. The conclusions are whether the hypothesis, the original question, the original statement that was tested, is it true or is it false? Is it right or is it wrong? Or what can we say about it? So the conclusions are important, but they're only important in the context of the question stated at the very start. The hypothesis that was used at the very start of the exercise. The conclusions should be openly stated, and the reader should not be left to seek out the conclusions. It is wrong to let the reader try to find out whether the conclusion was positive or negative, or the reader, that's not the reader's job. The reader is to look at the overall report, and the work should be done for the reader. It should be done objectively by the writer, by the researchers. They started with the hypothesis, the question to be asked. They conducted some research, they found the answer stated in the conclusions, and the writers should indicate that that is the answer, subject to the limitations of the research, as I said earlier. In the appendices, well, these are optional. You don't have to have appendices, but it's a good idea. They're used to present details that were not part of the research, but were not necessary to the presentation of the findings or conclusions. But they were consulted. They were used to generate data or generate insights. There could be previous reports or previous pieces of research. It could include raw data, for example. You don't want to make the report cluttered by presenting lots of raw data. So put the raw data into the appendices. Likewise, any calculations, the calculations can go into the appendices. Graphs, copies of forms or of the questionnaires, any tables that were used, perhaps they can go into the appendices as well. So forms, questionnaires, complex tables, these sort of things, move them into the appendices. Likewise, any instructions to researchers in the field. How were the interviews conducted? What briefing was given to the people conducting the survey, if it was a survey. Excuse me. Quantitative material that would look inappropriate in the main text. The reader may look at this if the reader wishes to, but more importantly, it's all done in the open. So the reader has confidence in the exercise, nothing was hidden. So all of the reports, the activities of the research are produced in the appendices. Care should be taken that they do not exist in isolation, and reference to each appendix is given in the text. Sometimes among students, for example, there's a tendency to insert into the appendices perhaps articles, academic articles, which were perhaps not even quoted in the main exercise. That is wrong. There's no point in bulking out the appendices. Only use sources of material that were actually quoted in the main text. That's important. The bibliography, well, it's a list of citations or references to books or periodicals, articles on a particular topic. Looks at journals that were consulted. All of these should be given at the end. There's a section entitled Bibliography, which lists all of the works consulted and lists them in alphabetic order, as I said earlier in this session. So list out all of these in alphabetic order by surname. And if government reports or industry reports are used, perhaps have a separate section in the bibliography called reports, and under there list all of the reports that were used. If it's done by people and if it's amenable to alphabetic listing, do so. It's easier for the reader to find the material that way. Some pieces of work have an index. It's usually given in published research work, but it's not necessary for all pieces of research. And business research, by and large, will not have an index. So this is more for bigger pieces of research. It would contain all the works consulted in the preparation of the report, not just those referred to in the text. So all the work that was used throughout the preparation of the report could be listed in the index. It's a consistent reference format should be used. So alphabetically it should be perhaps, or it could be done by date, or it could be done by the theme of the particular piece of work that's cited. As I said, an index is generally speaking not included in a business report. Business reports are much more efficient in the delivery of the information. They're small scale and they have got an integrity based on the techniques that were used, and they will have appendices and all those sections, but they don't necessarily have to have an index. They're not big enough, generally speaking, to have an index, so it's not included. So what we've done so far in this quite long session is we've looked at all of the different parts of the business research report. In fact, we've probably overdone it, and we've inserted probably too many areas, for example the index one here at the end, but we've listed all of the possible sections of the report and discussed some of the issues associated with each of them. Now, there are many other videos in this subject area that need to be looked at to get a greater insight into each of these, and that's something that you can do over the coming days. But that's all I'm going to do in this section, so I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.